A finance manager at a Fortune 500 airline signs a routine termination notice, canceling a lease on some mainframe computers his company no longer needs. It is a piece of paperwork, nothing more, a signature on a Tuesday. But that single cancellation is about to reach across the country and detonate one of the largest private frauds in American history. Somewhere in New York, two men who have spent a decade convincing the world's biggest banks that they are honest brokers are about to feel the floor tilt beneath them. They do not know it yet. Their empire, built on machines that were pledged again and again to lenders who never spoke to one another, is held together by a lie so simple it seems impossible anyone believed it. And in a few weeks, the phone calls will begin. To understand how one canceled lease could unravel a $250 million operation, you have to go back to the 1970s when computers were rare, expensive, and magical. A single IBM mainframe cost as much as a suburb of houses. Corporations needed them but hated the price, so a clever middleman business emerged. Leasing. A leasing company would buy the machine, then rent it to a corporation for years while financing the purchase through banks. The banks got a steady stream of lease payments. The corporation got its computer. The middleman took a slice. It was elegant, boring, and enormously profitable if you had the connections. Two young entrepreneurs founded a company on exactly this model, called it OPM Leasing, and set out to become the biggest players in the game. For a while, they were spectacularly good at it. OPM stood, they claimed, for a mundane phrase about leasing philosophy. Insiders later joked it really meant other people's money, and that joke would prove painfully accurate. The two founders were charismatic, generous, and hungry. They courted blue-chip clients, landed a giant contract with a major corporation, and used that credibility to borrow more and more from lenders eager for safe, computer-backed returns. On paper, everything looked pristine. Real machines, real corporate tenants, real monthly checks. But growth became addiction. Every new deal funded the promises made on the last one. And here is the first thread worth watching. A leasing company only makes money on the spread between what a client pays and what the machines cost to finance. That spread is thin. To grow fast, you either land more deals or you cheat. They chose to cheat, and the mechanics were almost childishly simple once you see them. A single computer installation at a client site could be documented with a lease agreement. That agreement was the collateral a bank accepted to lend money. So the founders began creating multiple lease documents for the same equipment, forging signatures, inventing terms, fabricating whole contracts, and pledging each fake lease to a different lender. One row of mainframes might secretly back loans from 3, 4, 5 separate financial institutions, each believing it held exclusive rights to that collateral. As long as the banks never compared notes, the illusion held. Fresh loans covered old payments. The money flowed in a widening circle, and the founders lived like royalty, jets, art, lavish gifts, while the pyramid beneath them grew heavier every single month. Sir, now return to that curiosity we planted. How could sophisticated banks miss forged paperwork on such a scale? The uncomfortable answer is that fraud thrives on trust and paperwork fatigue. Lenders were flooded with documents. Verifying every serial number on every mainframe across dozens of client sites was tedious, expensive, and, crucially, felt unnecessary when payments arrived on time. The founders understood this deeply. They were not hacking computers. They were hacking human procedure. They kept the checks flowing, stayed charming, funded charitable causes, and became the kind of clients bankers golfed with. A forged signature is only discovered if someone looks, and nobody had a reason to look because the whole system was engineered so that looking never paid. That is the quiet genius and the quiet horror of a well-run fraud. But a scheme that must always grow is a scheme with a countdown running inside it. Every fake lease demanded real monthly payments to the lenders, and those payments had to come from somewhere. They came from new loans against new fake leases. This is the structural signature of a Ponzi dynamic hidden inside an asset leasing business. The assets were partly imaginary, so the cash to service them could only come from the next victim. The founders needed ever larger deals just to stand still. One of them grew increasingly anxious, aware the arithmetic was turning against him. The other pushed harder, hunting bigger contracts, bigger loans, bigger lies. The company took on the trappings of a titan: prestigious offices, a growing staff, respected outside professionals lending it an aura of legitimacy no forger could have manufactured alone. That aura of legitimacy is the second thread, and it is the most disturbing part of the story. A fraud of this size cannot run for a decade in complete isolation. Along the way, warning signs surfaced, irregularities that troubled some of the professionals orbiting the company. There were moments when insiders suspected or half knew that something was deeply wrong, but acknowledging fraud meant unwinding relationships, forfeiting fees, and admitting complicity in a machine that had grown too large to stop cleanly. The path of least resistance was to look away a little longer, to accept a reassuring explanation, to assume someone else would catch it. This is the enduring lesson. Massive frauds rarely require one evil genius and a room full of fools. They require one determined liar and a surrounding cast willing not to ask the obvious question. The obvious question, when it finally came, arrived from the most ordinary place imaginable. A client simply not needing its computers anymore. Remember that termination notice? The airline's finance department decided to end a lease early. Standard business. But that lease was one of the load-bearing lies. It was tied, through forged duplicates, to money OPM had borrowed from lenders who believed those payments would continue for years. When the real client walked away, the payments that were supposed to justify the loans suddenly had no legitimate source. The founders scrambled to plug the hole with yet another round of borrowing, but the mathematics had finally run out of room. One canceled contract had pulled a single brick from the base of the pyramid, and the pyramid was made entirely of bricks like that one. What followed was the slow-motion horror of a fraud discovering itself. As lenders began at last to compare documents, the impossible pattern emerged. The same equipment, the same serial numbers, pledged over and over to institutions that had never suspected each other existed. Forged signatures, fabricated leases, client relationships that did not match the paperwork. The numbers were staggering. The fraud eventually totaled well over $200 million, an astronomical sum for its era. Panic rippled outward through the banking system as each lender realized its safe collateral was shared, duplicated, or entirely fictional. The company that had projected calm prosperity for a decade collapsed into bankruptcy almost overnight. And the two founders, once celebrated as leasing visionaries, now faced the full machinery of federal investigators peeling back every falsified page. The reckoning was severe. The scheme's architect was prosecuted and sentenced to a lengthy federal prison term, one of the harsher white-collar sentences of the period, while his partner's fate followed the collapse into ruin and disgrace. The bankruptcy became a landmark case, studied for years by lawyers and accountants trying to understand how the guardians of the financial system had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by photocopied lies. The failure of oversight touched everyone who had trusted the paperwork and skipped the verification. Careers ended. Reputations that had taken decades to build dissolved in months, and the lenders absorbed enormous losses on money they had believed was anchored to solid humming machines sitting in corporate basements, machines that, in far too many cases, had been counted 3 and 4 times over. Here is the original insight worth carrying out of this story, because it outlives the 1980s and the mainframes. OPM's fraud did not exploit a gap in technology. It exploited a gap in curiosity. The banks had every tool needed to catch it: serial numbers, client contacts, the physical machines themselves. What they lacked was any incentive to check while the checks kept clearing. Fraud does not usually break through your defenses. It walks past them because your defenses are pointed at strangers while the danger wears a familiar face and hands you a document that looks exactly like 1,000 real ones. The single most dangerous phrase in finance is not, "Trust me." It is, "We've always done it this way." Comfort, not deception, is the true accomplice. Consider, too, how the fraud's fatal flaw was also its founding logic. A business that survives only by growing is a business that has already decided how it will die. The moment expansion stalls, one lost client, one tightening credit market, one nervous lender who finally asks, the whole structure inverts, and the same speed that built it now dismantles it. OPM ran for roughly a decade, and to the outside world that decade looked like sustained success. In truth, it was a single continuous emergency, a man sprinting across collapsing ground, staying upright only by never stopping. The termination notice did not cause the collapse. It merely forced the sprinter to stand still for one moment, and in that moment gravity did what it had always been waiting to do. There is one final human note in the wreckage. Long before the end, at least one person inside the story sensed the truth and struggled with it, weighed down by knowledge too big to act on and too heavy to ignore. That is the quiet tragedy behind the headline numbers, not just the money stolen, but the countless small moments where someone almost spoke, almost asked, almost pulled the thread themselves, and didn't. Every great fraud is also a museum of unasked questions. The $200 million is the loud part. The silence that let it grow is the part that should haunt us, because that silence is the cheapest thing in the world to produce, and by far the most expensive thing to buy back once the machines turn out to belong to everyone and no one. If this pulled you in, understand that OPM was not a one-off glitch in an otherwise honest system. It is a pattern that repeats every generation with new assets, new jargon, and the same fatal comfort. On Bull and Bust, we take these collapses apart brick by brick so you can recognize the shape of the next one before it makes headlines. The forgeries change, the excuses change, the psychology never does. If you want to keep learning how empires built on paper actually fall, and how the smallest, dullest document can be the one that brings them down, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are dozens more of these stories waiting, each one hiding a lesson the powerful would prefer you never learned. Watch the next one. See if you can spot the fatal thread before we pull it.